Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 212 of the Book Cougars, two middle-aged women on the hunt for a good read. I'm Emily.
And I'm Chris. And this episode has been interrupted by a special announcement.
We have some breaking news. I've been keeping this under wraps, I think because I've been a little superstitious. But my daughter Rachel is expecting a baby. And Chris and I went to record the other day. We were both packing our bags literally to get in the car and go to Book Cougars headquarters. And I got a call from my daughter that her water had broken 3 weeks early. So instead of going to headquarters, I went to the airport and flew to Michigan. And the good news is that I made it in time for Rachel to have a beautiful baby girl. I was here for it. It's been a lovely few days. The bad news is we didn't get to record the episode.
Oh, that's no news at all. I think we should that's all good news. I'm so delighted for her and for you and for the new baby girl in the world.
Yes, baby Neena is here. And I know all of you are wondering, yes, I have already read her a book.
Nice.
I read her Spot Goes to the Farm in board book form. The Spot books by Eric Hill were one of Rachel's favorite when she was little, so it seemed appropriate that that would be Neena's first book.
Oh, I love that.
So we can't do an entire episode from a distance because mostly, to be honest, I have grandma brain. I'm tired.
Yeah. Grandma brain and no books with you. So we are just going to do a couple announcements. And most of this episode is going to be this fantastic conversation we had with Juliet Grames about her new book, which we both love.
Loved it so much. I have been misrepresenting the title of the book. I've been mispronouncing it. Chris indeed pronounces it correctly when we introduce Juliet, which she got a thumbs up for.
Well, and thanks to Juliet's social media. So if you're not following her on Instagram and other places, you should be, because she's doing some really wonderful promotion of the book with great images and correct pronunciation of things. So important.
Yes, that's right. So we have some housekeeping. We thought we would do some important announcements before we introduce our conversation with Juliet.
Yeah, one of the things is we just wanted to remind everybody that we have a buddy read going on right now of a fantastic big book. It's over 400 pages, so if you're doing Sue Jackson's Big Book Summer, it will qualify. It's Fellowship Point by Alice Elliott Dark.
I'm really enjoying it.
Me too. I just crossed the halfway point and really loving it. You know, deadlines are meant to be whooshed by quite often, but we are planning, along with our friend Kate, to have this finished and ready for conversation by July 20th. And we have a thread on our Goodreads page if you'd like to discuss the book there now, or if you're listening to this episode 5 years from now, if Goodreads is still around, we'll look at the notifications and jump in with you.
Yes, and we love to hear what people have to think about them. Just a reminder, if you do have spoilers in the things you're talking about, just put a little asterisk that says spoiler alert before you go into everything. But spoilers are definitely allowed. Just give people full warning.
Yeah, because sometimes I go in there with one eye closed, like,
right.
Ooh, yeah.
Am I going to get the big reveal and I don't want it yet?
Right. And then the other announcement is we did choose a date for our third quarter read along in our year of reading romance, which is Envy.
Yes, by Sandra Brown. Really excited about this one.
So September 15th will be the date for our Zoom discussion. If you'd like to participate, please send an email to bookcougars@gmail.com. And a few days before that conversation, you'll get a link to be able to participate. And we'd love for you to join us to talk about this. She's a romance writer, and this is the book in the mystery, thriller, suspense subcategory. So we're really curious to see how this goes. So September 15th, everyone.
We also have a thread for Envy over on our Goodreads page. Someone's already read the book. Nancy said, it's twisty, dark, and sexy. I haven't had so much fun reading a book in a long time. Looking forward to the discussion. So that's exciting.
It is exciting. Thanks for that, Nancy.
Yeah, twisty, dark, and sexy. I'm in. We'll put all these links in the show notes, everybody. Oh, we have one other thing to talk about, right?
Yeah, we do. Early in July, just last week, was it?
Yeah.
We took a Biblio Adventure to Long Island, New York, which is just across the Long Island Sound from where we live in Connecticut, and had a fantastic day. So we did our best to kind of capture the day in some photos and some video snippets. So we have a video on YouTube if you'd like to check that out.
Yeah, again, links are going to be in the show notes. And on episode 213, Chris and I will talk about it in, our Biblio Adventure segment. So you'll get a full recap then. But if you want a nice visual recap, head over to BookTube for now.
Yeah, episode 213, we'll be back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Yes, I can't say that I won't still have foggy grandma brain, but I'll do my best.
I think you're allowed to have that for the next 18 years, maybe?
I don't know. Maybe only parents can claim that. We'll see. It's a good excuse, if nothing else, for all that ails us.
This episode is sponsored by
The Heroine's Labyrinth, Archetypal Designs in Heroine-Led Fiction by Douglas A. Burton, is a nonfiction writing craft book that boldly presents a paradigm shift for story structure. Sourced entirely from heroine-centric stories, The Heroine's Labyrinth model offers a completely original and groundbreaking alternative to the hero's journey. The book has been endorsed by Hollywood and storytelling gurus such as Christopher Vogler and Matt Bird. Check out the show notes for more information. Coming up next is our conversation with Juliet Grames about her second novel, The Lost Boy of Santa CHIONIA.
Yes, and this is a mystery novel, which is her first. Juliet is an editor of mystery novels. I loved it. It has such a strong sense of place and great characters, which are two of the things that really get me hooked on a book.
Yeah, I agree. And we tried really hard in the conversation with Juliet not to have any spoilers. So Chris and I should also honor that by not spoiling anything as we introduce our conversation with Juliet. But I will say that it has, I think the best way to say it is, a very interesting ending.
It's one of those novels. It's so, I don't know if some people would call it a slow burn, but it's complex. You really have to pay attention.
Yeah, I was going to use the word layered. It's layered.
Yeah, complex and layered. To find out who done it, you really need to be in those layers, I think.
Yeah. And the one thing that Juliet told us, because Chris read it as an e-arc and I read it in paper form as an arc, but we both read arcs, that the finished copy has a great character name list, including the characters' nicknames. So it totally made me want to go back and read the book again with that list in hand.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. Because, you get the sense sometimes it's like one of those big old 19th century Russian novels with all these names. And it's just like, wait, is that the same? Yeah, you get what we're talking about, everybody.
Yeah. So refer to the character list when you're reading it. There's also a very fun map that her sister drew for the novel, which is pretty cool. And if you go to her social media, they're using that map to do really fun things as the countdown for this novel commences, because I believe the pub date is the 23rd of July.
Yes.
Yeah.
And our Patreon this month is going to get an early finished copy, which will be on the way when this episode goes live.
That's right.
It'll be on the way to somebody's mailbox.
Yes.
We hope you enjoy the conversation as much as we had having it.
All right, everybody. Happy reading.
We are so excited to welcome back Juliet Grames. Juliet was our guest on episode 137, where we talked about her first novel, the international bestseller, The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna. Her essays and short stories have been published in Best American Mystery and Suspense, Real Simple, Parade, Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine, and the Boston Globe. Julia is the editorial director at Soho Press. She was recently honored by the Mystery Writers of America with their Ellery Queen Award for excellence in editorial work in the crime fiction genre. She's back today to talk with us about her new novel, a literary mystery, The Lost Boy of Santa Chionia, which is set in the Aspromonte Mountains of southern Calabria in southern Italy. Welcome, Juliet.
Thank you so much. And thank you for pronouncing all those difficult words correctly. That is awesome. I'm really excited to be here. I love this podcast so much. It's so much fun to listen to, and now I get to talk on it. So
Thank you so much. Chris's little giggle in that introduction was when Juliet gave her a thumbs up when she pronounced CHIONIA correctly.
Yeah, CHIONIA is a challenge.
CHIONIA is a challenge, and thank you to your Instagram post for clarifying that, because we've had a lot of conversations where we've wondered if we were pronouncing it correctly.
And we weren't, so.
But now we are.
It's proper to have it correctly the day that you're our guest, so welcome. We thought that the first question we would ask would be about structure for this novel, because pretty soon into the reading of it, you realize that you're being told a story by Francesca 60 years later.
Yeah.
The main part of the novel takes place in 1960. So tell us about that choice as you were writing.
Well, that's right. So let me tell you what I knew I wanted to do from the beginning. This book is set in Calabria, which is the region of Italy that my grandmother was born in 1920. Of course, my first novel, The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna, which is a story of the Italian diaspora, a story about immigration to America, based on my grandmother's life, I did a ton of research about Calabria and about the diaspora. And I interviewed over 100 people. I really focused on women's stories, the women who were left behind and the women who immigrated for that novel. And what was left on the cutting room floor during that research process was this one story that recurred again and again and again and again. And it was about the missing immigrant man. He was the guy, he was the uncle or the brother of somebody's grandfather, or, in the early years of the 20th century, who sailed off to America or to other parts in search of opportunity and who just was never heard from again afterward. And I knew these stories, they really do make the hairs on my arms rise when I think about them, not just because it's so haunting to think that families have that, but because every family has that. And when I heard them, I knew I have two such stories in my own family, right? One in mine and one in my husband's. So that universality of just not knowing where this lost guy went, this limb that has been severed from your family tree, I think we get this generational trauma from it. 4 generations later, we're still wondering, where did that guy end up? Is he dead? Was he a victim of crime? Was he a victim of the marginalization that immigrants face? All of the dangerous things that happen in their lives, they're often victims of organized criminal syndicates or of unfair work, exploitative work practices, all those things. Or was this guy a scoundrel? Like, did he run off with another family? He decided to leave his responsibilities behind. And you just don't know. Like, not just his whereabouts, but the character of this strain of your family is called into question, right? And so this came up again and again and again. And I thought to myself, as you mentioned, thank you for bringing this up, but I am a crime fiction editor by day. And so that missing man, that question, those 3 permutations, victim or criminal or scoundrel, which is my Uncle Dominic, I was like, that's a crime novel. That's a crime novel. We're going to write a crime novel. So those are the bones of Santa Chionia, like looking at, as your reader will know from reading the copy on the book, the premise is that a skeleton is discovered under the post office. It hasn't been buried in consecrated ground. No one knows who the skeleton belongs to. And the main character, Francesca, ends up investigating different men who have disappeared in the village and trying to match the missing man to the skeleton, right? It's more than one missing man. So I knew I wanted to set it in 1960. 1960 is an era that's just fascinating in Italy in general. Post-World War II recovery was an extreme process there, really traumatizing. The state was struggling to pick up the pieces, and there was a lot of wreckage and a lot of people who were being left behind, especially in the south of Italy, where my family comes from, where the vast majority of Italian Americans have their origins in the South. It was really very much left behind. It was ripe with immigration and with organized crime stories, with missing men. These kinds of adventures were not yet, the stones weren't being turned over. They were happening, but they weren't being discovered. You get a little bit later into the 1970s and people are talking a lot more about the mafia. There are more present crackdowns. But the fact is, those troubles that were brewing that came to a head later in the century, the groundwork had already been laid. I was very curious about those human effects in this small village, like the one my grandmother came from, or this one I've written about in Yes Promote. I also knew that my main character, I wanted her to be like me. I felt that I had become a de facto immigrant detective during my work trying to write about the Italian diaspora. And I'd learned these investigative procedures in the course of it. I'd learned about how to track down documents at town halls, or where to go beyond that, how to find archives from closed businesses, how to search microfilms and microfiches to get to the bottom of misspellings, that things that are not cataloged, not available in Google. And I felt like I had been method acting her role already. I wanted her to be like me, a person who really, really desperately wants the best for the world around her, but sometimes fumbles with how to go about getting it. So I thought, you know what, I wanted an idealistic young woman in this moment in 1960. But I also knew that I wanted her to have the wisdom of the 20th century behind her. I wanted her to know about mafias. I wanted her to know about the ramifications of those problems. I wanted her to have a little more of a frame of reference about those humanitarian efforts that were engaged in the 1950s and 60s, things that today we wouldn't do. Yeah, I just wanted her to have that modern reader's connection looking back on the story. So that's why what you're getting is modern day Francesca Lawfield is telling this story. She's in her 80s and she's looking back at her time that she spent in Italy in the 1960s and unpacking those memories, which really stuck for her.
Yeah, I liked a lot of the details of the goofy American smile, which is such a great detail and really charming.
Yeah, I can't stop smiling when I meet someone. It's how I try to make people feel at ease with me. And of course, that's not native to Southern Italians. Their standard is not to smile. And so it was a thing I encountered on interviews a lot. When people are looking at you, they're like, why are you smiling like a goofball? And Americans, it will take them a while to realize, oh, these people aren't mean. They're actually friendly. They just don't smile as much, So, despite having been born into an Italian family, some of those lessons are ones that I've had to learn again and again during my interview process. Yeah. And I gave the gift of my suffering to Francesca. So I'm like, hey, I learned this in the moment. You get to suffer this too, baby.
As a young woman. Yeah.
Well, so did you have an outline in mind when you were writing this? Because, I mean, it's so complex in many ways. I feel like maybe you had to have had one.
I pre-wrote this. They divide writers into pantsers and plotters. You've heard those before. I was interviewing Colin Walsh, a crime writer, yesterday for BNN, and he had a great little, I hadn't heard this before, that there are two kinds of writers. There are gardeners who grow their stories, or there are architects who design and build. I'm an architect. I will outline an email before I send it. So not only did I outline this book, I also did background writing to the tune of 200,000 words before I even sat down to start writing it. I'm asking you, the reader, to trust me with this very foreign place. It's so foreign that I made it up. Santa CHIONIA itself doesn't exist, right? I had to create something ground up, and I really need the reader to believe in it, and I need them to believe in the people who live there. So I did a lot of preparatory groundwork there. I outlined the story, I outlined the plot, I outlined the details of every character, including very minor characters. I know everything about them. Quiz me. Except no spoilers. So I guess we'll do this after we hang up. But yeah, I just love to outline. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. I love that feeling of putting together points and knowing where you want them to be, and the constellation not quite coalescing until you've moved more things around, and then to write within that with that sort of authority of knowing where everything is going. But I know a lot of writers, what I just said, this would give them hives.
Right. Well, I mean, it really shows because there's so many characters to keep track of, and the place is a character. Having you describe it that way, all that work was backstory in your own mind that you had to create first.
Thank you for saying that. Creating Santa CHIONIA was maybe the most fun of all, even more fun than the characters, because I knew I wanted a village that didn't actually exist, because some of the stories that I've borrowed, these historical moments that happen in the book, they really did happen. And I wanted this book to be a fun read. I wanted it to be an adventure and a romance and a mystery and a puzzle for readers, but it does draw on some very dark local history. And I didn't want to actually, implicate real people who may be living or descendants of people who suffered some of these traumas. But one of the phenomena that happened a lot in the middle of the century in Italy, but elsewhere too, tell me if this sounds familiar to you, is forcible depopulation of marginalized groups. And so in Italy, this took the form of taking villages that were of linguistic or ethnic minorities. So in the case of Santa Chionia, this is a Greco village. They speak a language called Greco. It is a Greek grammar based with some Calabrian words throughout. It's drawn from Byzantine and classical Greek. It's very ancient. And people have continued to speak it. It's dwindling because in the middle of the 20th century, there was an eradication movement. Children were forced to learn Italian, and these villages were broken up. The Italian government tried to move everyone to the coast. The reason for moving people from their native villages where they had lived for 1,000 or 1,500 years was because the villages weren't safe. So things like the flood that happens at the beginning of Santa Chionia, that would be a reason that people shouldn't live here anymore, or lack of roads, or lack of running water or electricity. Any of these services could have been put in by the government, but instead the thought was to move people out. And is that because they wanted to mainstream or to control the resistance or the ethnic differences, the conversations in these villages? These things really, really happened. So at the heart of the inspiration for Santa Chionia is a real village called Africo. So it's like Africa, but with an O at the end. And if you want to read some interesting stuff, I did include in my author's notes some sources if people are interested in reading further. But that was a village that was forcibly depopulated in 1950 and 51 after a flood. It's now this ghost town in the mountains. I've been there. I had this amazing spooky adventure there during my research process, and that's a whole other story. But I just found the history of that town so compelling that I needed to write about it. So in this book, Africo exists. It's the neighbor next to Santa Chionia, and the people in Santa Chionia often talk about people they know in Africo or what happened there. So I get to honor that history a little bit while fictionalizing it and taking it in my own direction and talking in a plain spoken way about how forced population movements and government marginalization really connect to things like the advent of organized crime in a community.
Yeah. Follow the money, right?
Yeah, follow the money. That's right.
Yeah.
You got it.
Well, can we go back to what you were talking about you having chipper smiling faces and some of the people you came into contact with being serious?
Yes.
We have this great picture that came with the arc that we got.
Yes.
Can you tell us about your experience with Maria?
Yes. So Maria Volonta is, at the moment that we're recording this, she is 99 years old. She was born in February of 1926 in a village called Bova, which also features in the book. And Bova is a Greco village. It has maintained its Greco heritage this whole time. It's now sort of the cultural capital of the re-enlivening of the Greco linguistic minority movement. Maria is fantastic. I was introduced to her and her daughter, Antonella, who is an architect. I was introduced to them by a bagpipe player named Danilo Brancati, who was my interpreter and chaperone when I was going through the Aspromonte Mountains for 2 weeks on a research trip. Danilo is a young man who's also part of this movement. And these people are trying to restore the Greco language and Greco cultural heritage in a wider arena. But since I first met her in 2019, Maria and her daughter Antonella have kept in touch with me via WhatsApp. I mean, all through the pandemic, I'd be writing this book and I'd be like, I just need to know, what would you have eaten on the feast of St. Martin? And then they would reply, and they would cook the recipes, and they'd send me photos or videos of them cooking the recipes. And then she's been such an amazing cultural resource to me. But both of those women, I'm so grateful to them. And Maria in particular is sort of a spiritual source of energy for me in this book. I named one of the main characters Emilio Volonta. I gave her Maria's last name. I gave her description. In my mind, she's Maria. Maria was born in this village in 1926. There were no schools. She's always had a passion for reading. She taught herself to read when she was 6, and she reads in 3 languages. She reads in Italian, Calabrese, and Greco, her native Greco. And they didn't have any books. And so there was this traveling library that would have a cart, like with newspapers or periodicals that she would borrow. And she grew up just a very modest, a farmer's daughter. She never handled money until she was in her 30s. It's 1955. She had to go to a neighboring village to buy medicine for her husband. And this story was one that really struck me about how capitalism was used or misused in this area where people were still, because of the lack of access to resources like education, people were still living on the feudal farm holdings. I mean, feudalism had been banished 100 years before that, right? But people, they didn't know because the people who owned the land didn't bother to tell them. And so people were still working the land. They were paid in kind. They weren't paid for their labor, and they were told that they couldn't leave. And, you know, Maria also told me a really stirring story about every house had a chicken. And when the chicken laid an egg, like it was your job to raise the chicken, but when the chicken laid an egg, you had to give the egg to the landowner. That was like a tribute you paid. You only got to keep the egg if your baby was sick. And then you could roast the egg because it was known that a roasted egg, the calories were good for a baby. It would help a sick baby with a fever. She tells me these stories with just this warmth and this love of her culture, of where she came from. And she really helped me. They infuriate me. The stories infuriate me, but they don't infuriate her. She has given me this vision of how people lived inside these parameters, you know, in living memory, not just people, but people who are connected to the people who birthed me. Like, this is living memory. This is where my grandmother came from. And it's so amazing to feel so close to the way our recent ancestors lived, what they went through, looking at how people survived and gave us everything that we have today. It's just such an inspiring process.
Yeah. Oh, beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, no, she's amazing. I could talk about Maria for an hour. I actually got to interview a lot of people, a lot of elderly people in their 80s and 90s in particular, people who were victims of the depopulation movements from these different towns. I did a lot of interviews for this. But I will say Maria and Antonella have been my main interlocutors, and they've continued to help me just nail down all these details. Oh, and if you like, on my website, they actually helped me put together 2 recipes for a book club dinner kit. So they're both things that Maria taught me how to cook, and my publisher put together this beautiful little Vlad, if you want to go on and check it out for.
Oh, that was going to be one of my burning questions is Stella Fortuna. There was a little cookbook that came out. So I was wondering if you were going to put out for this one, like lentils cooked 50 ways or something like that.
Thank you for citing the lentils. So important. It's such a neat cuisine because they're up in the mountains. They actually don't have access to grain, right? So when you think of Italian cooking, you probably don't think of the way they were eating in the Aspromonte, and the creative ways that they got through are fascinating. Like bread made out of lentils.
I was gobsmacked when I read that.
Yeah. And it's funny because when they were first talking about the depopulations in the 20s and 30s, they were suggesting that these villages should be moved. Lentil bread was this outrage platform for mainstream Italian journalists. They were like, oh my God, this bread that these people eat, it's black and it falls apart in your hands. I'm like, actually, has a really high protein content.
Yes.
I mean, the food is fascinating. I would love a project of more Aspromonte recipes in a cookbook. So I've got that on my back burner, I promise you. In the meantime, I have put a fair amount of food description into the book.
Yes.
So you may have noticed.
I was wondering about barley coffee too. I was like, wow, I've never heard of that.
Yeah, because real coffee was so hard to come by. So roasted barley or chicory were the 2 main replacements, right?
Yeah. So listeners, Francesca, who's 27 in 1960, she's going there to establish a kindergarten or preschool for little children to help with nutrition in part and education of, hygiene and things like that. And obviously learning how to read and a beginning education as well. Because you mentioned the lentils and the food all sound really good, but it's also a subsistence diet.
Yes, it is.
And it's hard going.
It is. It's hard going. It is. So Francesca's The model for her work is actually drawn from a real historical figure. There was an American writer named Anne Cornelison who was a Vassar graduate, and she would have been about the same age as Francesca. And she moved to Italy in 1954 and was working for Save the Children, a British nonprofit organization that did exactly these things. Their target was to reduce child, infant, and maternal mortality. But the work that they did around that was multifaceted. Establishing a nursery school was thought to, first of all, you get the kids out from underfoot of the mother. So she has more time in infancy to work on things like getting the home clean and hygienic and, producing good food for them and taking care of maybe a nursing baby. Also, it's a place where you can bring in a local pharmacist who can give out inoculations once a year, things like that. It's an access point. And so Anne Cornelison went and did that for Save the Children. I've made up an imaginary charity called Child Rescue, in case you were wondering what inspired it. Save the Children did not go past Cosenza as they were going south in the Italian peninsula. They never ventured into the Aspromonte Mountains. So I knew I wanted this book set. So I made up an imaginary formula there to bring Francesca into these mountains. But yeah, I drew heavily in inspiration from the writing work of Anne Cornelison. She wrote a number of memoirs that were really important resources to me for both of my books about how women lived in Italy during this time. So if you're looking for more reading along those lines, I highly recommend Women of the Shadows. It describes 5 women who she lived and worked with in Basilicata in the 1950s. It's great.
We'll put a reference to that in the show notes. So, it's really hard to talk about this novel without having too many spoilers.
Yeah.
But
yes.
So we don't want to spoil anything for you listeners, but I wanted to ask you, and maybe if you can't talk about this in a way that doesn't, that we can't have spoilers, we don't have to talk about it. But there is this concept of reparative marriage that comes up in the novel that I thought would be interesting to talk about.
Yes, I absolutely would love to talk about this. So one thing that has continued to fascinate me in all of my research into the Italian diaspora, I come from a family of very strong Italian women. The women are very strong. I think most Italians will say what I just said. There are very few Italians who are going to be like, the Italian women in my family are weak. Like, that's not. However, I believe that partially that strength was developed in opposition to the structures that women had to deal with. Italy is a place where women were not citizens in Italy until 1946. They were classified as B-class personages. And you'll see, even in the book, this deals with some of these issues later, women were literally owned by their father or their husband when they got married. So a man had the right, literally, like if a man were to have killed his neighbor under the Rocco Law Code, that would be murder, and he would go to prison for 8 to 20 years, depending on how the crime was prosecuted. However, if he killed someone, quote unquote, during discipline, when that person was, quote unquote, a person under his authority, i.e. a wife or child, then he would only go to prison for 2 years. And not only that, that sentence could be commuted if he made a case successfully that the discipline had been called for. In other words, a man could murder his wife with impunity. So those are the structures of how the patriarchy worked. In Italy, women had absolutely no rights. They were not allowed to control money. They were not allowed to control land. Even after those laws change and they become full citizens in 1946, they still have no right to divorce. So, your husband is indefinitely the authority of your life, even if the marriage is really bad. And then on top of this, you have this extra foil of the Catholic Church, which is really ever present in Italian communities, not just as a religious or a spiritual center of the community, but an actual municipal structural center of the community. The Catholic Church, as you see in this book, they control records. So like the town hall will have birth records, but for some reason, all of the property transfer deeds go through the church. The church and state are not separate in Italy the way they are here. So the extra layer here is Catholic morality. And one of the things that plays a lot into conversations in this era is virginity, and a woman's virginity particularly, and how sacred that is to a marriage. So the reparative marriage story was one I was familiar with because I had heard it before, but it did come up a lot in my research, particularly, okay, I will back off on spoilers there, but a reparative marriage is when a couple engages in sex before marriage, and therefore they are out of favor with God. So the only way to rectify that sin is for them to repair themselves by getting married. They repair the sin that was done by having a reparative marriage. There's a dialect word for it, fuitina, that I use in the book. Fuitina means escape. So it could even be considered elopement. And so fuitina could be very romantic. It can be like a young couple that have been forbidden from getting married by their parents for whatever reasons. And then, there's a sympathetic aunt who's like, you guys deserve to be together. Come spend the night at my house. And then after they've spent the night at her house, they tell their parents, hey, guess what? We did the deed. Got to get married now. And then so it's sort of a form of elopement, or some people even use it just the word to mean elopement, meaning we don't want to pay for a big wedding. We're going to run out of here and get married at City Hall, whatever it is. However, a reparative marriage isn't necessarily consensual. And that is the story that has upset me so much throughout my research, is when a guy decides he wants to marry a woman, she doesn't want to marry him. So he decides to put her in a position where she has to marry him or be at odds with God. In other words, to kidnap her and rape her, and therefore have her consent to marrying him afterward. Now, what's really interesting about this time period, 1960, is you're starting to get for the very first time women who have been through this awful trauma, who have fought back against the church, which is telling them to just fix themselves and get married to their rapists, even the government. So there's this really brave woman in Sicily named Franca Viola, who this trauma happened to her. And what happened was her rapist was a man who was very present in his community. He was respected, and he offered marriage to her, which in the eyes of the state and the church was the right thing to do. Like, this was just a romantic guy who wanted to get married from, a structural point of view, which is so anathematic for us to hear about now, right? But this is the case. Up until 1996, when those divorce laws started to change, rape was still not a criminal act. It was considered a social crime. So as a social crime, you could still repair it by offering marriage to, save this woman who you have insulted. So she refuses to marry him. He basically sues for her to marry him, and the government approves his suit, and she says, I'm not going to marry him. And she ends up taking the case to Supreme Court to fight for her right not to marry her rapist. This woman went through trial after trial. I mean, she fought back against her whole town. And I think she was so brave. She just never gave up. And really, that was a watershed moment in this conversation. But we're looking at 1960. And in my research, I found that on a local basis, this was something that other women had done as well. It was really, really hard. It's like your priest is telling you should just marry him because it creates so much unrest in the town if you don't. And this guy, he wants to do the right thing. Look, he's taking responsibility for his actions, right? And on top of that, God really wants you don't have your virginity anymore, which is the one thing about you that really matters. And God wants you to be, eligible for heaven again. So why don't you fix this? This is the pressure that these women would have been under. I mean, it's almost insurmountable to think about. And the way those stories about the disenfranchisement of women under the system sort of knit into the greater patriarchal structure that allows a mafia to exist in a town, I really wanted to write about that. I wanted to really pin that down and pin down how when we have a patriarchy, when we don't fight for total equality in all fields for women, we are always vulnerable to those abuses. And the abuses, they magnify, they layer on top of one another.
Well, and just that birth control was illegal.
Mm-hmm,
and
yes.
that there were women who'd been through 30 pregnancies.
Yes.
I mean, that just
yes.
is unimaginable.
Yes, that was another fascinating part of my research. There was actually an organization in Rome, first opened by Clarence Gamble, of Procter and Gamble, but then run by an Italian couple in the 1950s, Maria Luisa Zantedeschi, called Pathfinder. And this organization distributed contraceptives in the slums around the Vatican in Rome. And I knew Francesca, my character, I mean, you'll see in the book, but she lives and works in Rome, and it's one of her contact points with the charity she ends up working with. So I read a lot of pamphlets from this time around what was going on in the immediate post-war era. But I mean, access to birth control, it's incredible the difference that it makes for women. I mean, just to have to be forced to go through with 30 pregnancies in one's life, or the loss of children. You know, there are movies about this. Do you remember La Strada? It's about a child who's sold. She's basically sold to be a prostitute on the road with a circus performer. And, you know, that's from this era as well. Children were being sold. They were gelsaminas everywhere. And women had to watch their kids go through that. It was so traumatizing.
Yeah.
An era of rapid acceleration in these conversations, though, about women's rights. So really interesting time to write about.
Yeah.
And interesting, also layered with our own politics that were going on at the time that you were writing, which we don't need to get into. But
well, you know, here's the thing. I was writing this book. I was writing historical fiction. It's also, as you were reading it, I'm sure you felt that it was allegorical, because everything that I wrote about was an issue that has been of personal interest to me for very vibrant and present reasons now. And, you know, I started actually putting this book down on paper in 2020, but it's just become more and more present moment for me as the writing and editing process has gone on. So I hope that readers find solace and interest in the conversations about these issues, which I think are so relevant to what we're going through today. For me, they're the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One of the things that I appreciated, and it is heavy, there are these heavy topics in there, but it's also a beautiful book with a lot of humor in it as well. And then some really good advice. One of the things I really liked, it's something I believe Sabrina said, who is Francesca's boss, her advisor, and talking about not burning yourself out, doing humanitarian work and helping, and saying that you're not the battery, you're a wire.
Yes.
And like your job is to complete the circuit.
Yes.
And I thought that was so beautiful. I'd never heard volunteer work described in that way.
Yes. This is Francesca's dilemma, how to actually help, how to use her energy to make the world a better place in a way that doesn't hurt herself or other people. And it's hard. And that was my central question as I was writing this. Every day I think about that. What can I do that is actually going to make the world around me better? What am I doing that's maybe a waste of my time, or not? It's not the best use of resources, or it's not making that much of an impact. I think about this every day, and bringing that out into this character was absolutely the most important part to me of writing this book. I will tell you that circuit wire advice, I cannot take credit for that. I am so grateful to a writer named L.A. Kaufman, who wrote this absolutely essential guide to being involved in demonstrations or thinking about how to organize demonstrations. And so in her introduction, she talks about her own friend, the activist Brad Will, Will. That was his lifelong motto. That was his story. And he died very young, in his early 30s. He was killed when he was doing activism work. And so, yeah, I'm really grateful I got to use it with her permission and keep it alive in this story, just in case people aren't out reading handbooks on how to effectively be activists. Maybe they'll encounter it here, because I think it's just good advice for everyone. Be the wire, be the conduit of other people's good energy, and we need to feed into one another and power goodness. But it's not your job to give everything you have until the point that you can't support yourself anymore either.
Yeah. So important. And, you know, you just mentioned an author. You also mentioned authors throughout the novel. 4 that we wrote down, Natalia Ginsburg, Jean McLeod, Laudamia Bonani, and Marion Alt. Tell us a little bit about that. Why did you include these writers specifically?
Thank you for this question. Oh, you're amazing. There are a lot of Easter eggs in the book that I put in for myself. And if anyone else gets them, which you have started to get them, this is amazing. It's just so satisfying. Francesca, my narrator, she's a bookworm. You know, she's an academic. She loves to read. And she's also a person like me who encounters and makes judgments on the world based on books, and then later has to kind of reconcile what reality is based on, you know, the ideas she's already created from fiction and nonfiction book learning. Because, you know, another lesson she gets from this from this story is that books can only get her so far, right? That's a lesson I'm always learning. All the writers you mentioned and some of the others I have embedded either they have links to this area. So Laudamia Bonanni was a really, really important writer from the Abruzzi region, female writer who was basically untranslated during her lifetime, sort of lost. And only recently has there been a rediscovery movement for her. And I think female writers in general, in translation, they tend to either not be translated as much as their male counterparts or not taken as seriously or they fall out of print. So, that's why I wanted to elevate some attention for her. Plus, it's relevant if you're interested in this time and period. The American and British female writers who I include are either people who would have overlapped with Francesca at one of her two institutions of learning. So she has her undergraduate from Barnard College, and then she goes on to drop out of a PhD program at Oxford. Or they are perhaps linked, like Mary Stewart is linked to a lot of Odyssey references and classical Greek literary references that I put throughout, because this area of Calabria, this is the home of Homer. Like Homer, so much of the Odyssey is set in and around these parts, and it's still, Greek speaking. The traditions are very strong there. And I love connecting my own heritage to Greek classical culture, because people think, oh, Italy is Italian. It's also Greek. And so there are tons of, I've actually made a whole longer sort of source inspirations list that I'd be very happy to share with you for if there are some real true deep nerds in your listenership.
Oh yes.
I love you. I love you. Share my nerdiness with you.
Oh yes. Please share. Yeah.
We would love that.
Oh gosh, Julia, I feel like we can talk with you for 10 hours and still be bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and
be in touch with us if you need anyone to, test those lentil recipes. We'd be glad to do that.
You are booked for that. You are absolutely, you are on the hook. You're going to have to eat 50 varieties of lentils.
Hey, Emily cooks and I'll eat. I mean, she'll eat as well, but
Oh my goodness.
Thank you so much for having me for this absolutely delightful conversation. I'm so happy to be here and be part of this.
And we wish you so much luck with the launch. And we will put a link in the show notes to your book tour. You're going to be in lots of wonderful places talking to great people. And we'll be watching from the sidelines and maybe even attending some.
Yes, hopefully.
Oh, I hope to see folks out. I'm doing a lot of stuff around New England in particular. So I'm really excited.
Thanks for listening to The Book Cougars with Chris Wallach and Emily Fine. We'll be back again with another episode in 2 weeks. Until then, come chat with us on social media, Goodreads, or email us at bookcougars@gmail.com. If you'd like to help support our podcast, please tell others about us, leave a review wherever you listen, and consider becoming a patron. Even $1 a month is a big help. Learn more about that on our website, bookcougars.com, where you'll find the show notes for this and all of our past episodes.
Thanks, everybody.
This episode was edited by Pat Keogh Sound Design.